Hi, welcome everybody to this session of the 2020 Watch List Policy Dialogue. My name is Renata Segura, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Crisis Group's Latin America and the Caribbean program. As you may know, the Watch List Policy Dialogue is an annual event where we take a look at some of the crises around the world, we examine what are the causes behind this crisis, and we discuss some policy options, particularly for the EU and its member states, to prevent, mitigate, and help solve deadly conflicts. In these sessions, we draw from analysis and recommendations that have been presented by crisis groups' yearly issues on the EU Watch List, the Watch List 2020, and the May and September 2020 updates. And this event is part of a project that is co-funded by the European Commission under the instrument contributing to stability and peace, and in partnership with the European External Action Service. In this panel that we're now starting, we'll be examining the economic fallout of COVID-19 in Latin America and what challenges it will bring or is bringing already for regional stability and security. I'm joined today by two wonderful panelists, Ana Maria Tribin, who is a public policy specialist at the Regional Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean at UNDP, and by Ivan Briscoe, our own program director for Latin America. Both Ana Maria and Ivan join us today from my hometown in Bogota. I am in New York, and for those listening to us from the US, happy Thanksgiving. So let me give you first a little bit of direction of how the session is going to go before we turn into our substantial conversation. This conversation is being recorded for public record, and we are broadcasting on Crisis Group YouTube channel. We have an hour total for the discussion, and for the first half, I will ask Ana Maria and Ivan some questions on the issue at hand, and then we will open the discussion for questions from the audience. If you're joining us by Zoom, you will see there's a little box that says Q&A in the bottom of your screen, so you may type your question there, and I'll be able to see them and send it back to Ana Maria and Ivan when the Q&A is open. We're doing this more interactive voting on the questions. So as you see as you're listening to the conversation, keep an eye on the questions that are being asked, and you can vote for them so they come up on the list and I can ask them first. So if you see a question that you're very interested in, you can mark it with the thumbs up icon next to it, and that will bring it up to the top. And obviously, we encourage you to type your questions as the conversation goes. So that we have plenty of discussion during the Q&A. So let's turn now to Ana Maria and Ivan for the beginning of this panel. And perhaps we should start with Ana Maria. Why don't we start with a general overview of the impact of the pandemic in the Latin American economies? How do you think is the region going to look when the pandemic is over? Are there some countries that are going to be worse off? What are you worrying the most for the coming year?
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. Latin America has some of the highest COVID death rates in the world. Half of those deaths are from Brazil. In economic terms, the latest projections estimate a contraction of 9.4% in regional GDP. The worst recessions are for Mexico, Peru, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and Colombia. At least 34 million jobs in Latin America and the Caribbean have been lost during this period. Household surveys show that the number of individuals out of the labor force is now surpassing those into it. We're expecting a 10% point increase in poverty rates in the regions because of the pandemic. The informal labor market in Latin America is huge, making up 54% of all work across the region. Informal workers have little access to social protection and have no choice but continue to work daily. So they are at risk of poverty and contagion. Latin American countries have some of the highest income inequalities in the world. Nevertheless, we were in a process of slow improvement, closing gaps in several fronts. But the pandemic is making us going back at least 2 decades, increasing inequality. Also, because before the pandemic, we came from huge protests due to the discontent of people. Now we already see Peru that is suffering from political instability, And it is possible that the increasing inequality will lead to polarization and social unrest. Keep in mind that most Latin American countries are close to have elections. So it is not ideal to have these levels of polarization, but I'm optimistic. I believe that the pandemic, by worsening all inequalities and exaggerating them, makes them visible. And we can no longer afford to ignore them and live as they don't exist. Now we are seeing governments thinking about how to straighten out directions and make structural changes. So I see this as an opportunity.
Thank you, Ana Maria. That's a very interesting point, and I think it connects with the first question that I wanted to ask Ivan, which is precisely what is this economic crisis going to mean in terms both of security challenges, but also in terms of stability? And as Ana Maria well pointed, we came into the crisis when the continent had gone through a series of strikes, popular mobilization. What are you seeing both in challenges, both on the security area, but also in terms of stability?
You're absolutely right. I mean, in many ways, what we're seeing with COVID, with the pandemic, is a continuation or an aggravation of the trends of the last few years. Let's remember, Ana Maria is absolutely right. These are terrible economic indicators under COVID, but Latin American economies have been flatlining since 2013. Since the end of the commodity boom, particularly in a place like Venezuela, which has collapsed economically, but also in Argentina and Brazil. I mean, alongside that economic malaise, we've seen recurrent major political protests, unrest since 2017, 2018 across the region, in authoritarian governments, obviously protesters for democracy, but also in democracies, people protesting against social injustice, against corruption, against the perception that, you know, political and economic elites are sewing matters up for their own benefit, which was the case in Chile, for example. And we're seeing criminal violence, fragmented criminal violence, high levels, ongoing levels of high murder rates in Mexico, Brazil, in Central America and elsewhere. So there's lots which was very difficult in Latin America before COVID. The end of 2019 saw a huge wave of protests across the region. And as Ana Maria said, COVID has exposed economic inequalities, but it's also preyed on those economic inequalities. The people who've been hit the hardest have been the poorest in urban areas where there's overcrowding, where there's limited access maybe to running water, in certain cases where people have to go out and work, there's no alternative to continue working in the informal market. It's exposed failures of state policy, Peru in particular, which had an excellent model for dealing with COVID, but it didn't apply to the reality of the citizens who had to go out and work every day, who had to go to markets for food. And it's also allowed lockdowns, pandemic lockdowns have allowed local criminal groups to increase their power at the local level, because they're the ones who've monitored and controlled lockdowns and in certain cases been giving resources to and handouts to local people. So I think the question now is how, what Ana Maria describes, how all those, the pandemic, the lockdowns, the economic effect is now going to feed in to political instability and insecurity in the future. I mean, this is a very complex story. We've seen Peru and Guatemala in recent days in a state of uproar, clearly related to the effects of COVID. I think we will see increasing scrutiny of political establishments, particularly parliaments, as well as presidents, because they're going to be charged with some very important financial and political decisions in the months ahead. And if they do not conform to what is seen as the public interest, there will be questions. I think we'll see an increase in people moving into criminal activity, moving into illicit livelihoods if there's no economic alternative, particularly in contexts like Mexico, Colombia, and Central America. And I think there's a big question which is looming over Latin America now, and Ana Maria sees as an opportunity. It's also a risk, which is the vaccination programs, which we hope will be rolled out over Latin America. Are they fairly handled? Do they target the most vulnerable populations? Do they reach the poorest populations? These are questions which we hope will be answered next year.
Thank you both. Quite a complicated scenario on both of those terms. So I wanted to turn now to examining some of the most specific situation for vulnerable populations. And why don't we start with Ana Maria and the question of women and girls in the pandemic, and what's the standing? What has been the impact of COVID for women in the region, both in terms of economic well-being, but also gender-based violence that we saw was going up? What is the gender lens through which we can see what's happening in the region right now?
Okay, the recession has impacted women more than men, going back decades of closing gender gaps. All Latin American countries show greater inactivity and unemployment for women relative with men. There are three conditions by which women have been more affected than men. The first one is that when schools close, the burden of care falls mainly on women. Women in Latin America account for 74% of the total hours of unpaid work and care. Many women will be left unemployed or in an activity relegated to domestic work. The economic dependence has many implications, such as an increase in domestic violence, and the economic literature shows that reducing the empowerment of women has negative impact in nutrition, education, and general well-being of children. Unlike other recessions, this one has contracted more the feminized sectors, such as restaurants, domestic services, commerce, etc. And Latin America has a very marked occupational segregation. So women are losing more jobs, or jobs at a much greater rate than men. Finally, Latin America has one of the highest rates of single mothers, 30%. Many of these women will have to leave the market because of the shock of unpaid care that they are experiencing, or just because they are seen as less productive by their employers. In addition, since the social security systems in Latin America have not been well designed, it excludes the informal sector. So these systems focus on poverty and on formal workers. And most women in Latin America are in the formal sector. A fraction of them are in the poverty, but the majority of them are not in poverty. So they are not even in the government records. So they are going to remain without a safety net. It is estimated that the pandemic will leave around 118 million women and girls in poverty in the region. The other thing that concerns me is that we have a very high rate of infant and adolescent pregnancy. And with all these quarantines, girls being inside a house with a predator in the house, that is going to exacerbate this problem. I think that is going to be a huge problem for our countries.
Thank you, Ana Maria. Quite a bleak assessment right there. Ivan, why don't we turn now to the question of migrants and refugees, which is another vulnerable population that has been affected severely by the pandemic. What have been the main consequences for these groups?
Thank you, Renata. I mean, this is a crucial area for Latin America. We're looking at two main migration flows, both of which to an extent have been bottled up, you know, with the border controls, border closures, difficulties of movement, travel restrictions, and which could really blow up in the next few months. Well, that's the fear, at least. We'll have to see what happens. The first of them, obviously, is Venezuela. We're talking about the biggest emigration, the biggest sort of pocket of emigrants in the whole region, probably in the whole of history, recent history at least, 5.4 million Venezuelans outside the country, according to the latest estimates from the UN, 1.7 million of them in Colombia. Now, Colombia has the largest border with Venezuela. At the moment, that border is closed. It's been closed by the Colombian government since March. Now, people still come across in very difficult conditions on illegal crossings, but, you know, it's been a bit of a trickle. And also there've been a number of Venezuelans, over 100,000, going back to Venezuela in recent months because of what Ana Maria says. The informal economy has shut it up in the lockdown in Colombia, and there were no opportunities. But that's changed now. And Colombia's opened up. At some moment, the border will probably reopen. The government's holding its cards close to its chest here, but they fear the results. I mean, the expectation in government circles is in the first 6 months of next year, you could be looking at 500,000 Venezuelans coming into Colombia. I mean, it's that serious. And the condition for Venezuelans here in Colombia is not good. I mean, there's an effort by the Colombian state to reach them, but they're living in extreme poverty, the most of them, and half of them have no residency documents. Of course, the other great issue, more a concern for the United States, is emigration from Central America. Now, we know that President Trump's policy has been very hard, very strict, talk of the wall, border controls, family separation, all these other policies. But the reality is that, you know, this migration is driven by the causes of poverty, insecurity, and desperation in the Northern Triangle countries, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And these conditions have got a lot worse over the last few months. We're talking about hundreds of thousands or more unemployed, violence at continuing levels, and of course the effect of the hurricanes Iota and Eta, which have been devastating in Honduras in particular. So we can expect this migration to continue, even if there are still these very fast returns, repatriation policies to Mexico, which we've seen by the US Border Patrol on the recently. But the pressure will continue, and it will be a challenge for the incoming administration in the United States to handle this, and to do so in a way which respects the humanitarian needs of these people, because they are running away from a desperate situation.
Thank you, Ivan. Very, very, difficult in that area too. Why don't we look at Colombia now, specifically? Maybe Ana Maria, I can ask you, how is the country being affected by the pandemic? How are women in Colombia being affected? What do you worry about?
Well, we find for Colombia a loss of 1.2 million jobs, with an unemployment rate of 16%, almost a 5 percentage point more than in October 2019. Last month, the unemployment of women was around 21%, while the one for men was 12%, is also high. Participation rate of women went down by 10 percentage points from 2019 to 2020. And now it is 49%. So less than half of the female population is participating in the labor market. Keep in mind that in average, women are more educated than men in Colombia. So that is completely inefficient. The participation for men is 71%, and it has also been reduced, but just for 1 point. Also, the situation for women is concerning, given that if we look at census data, 41% of the households are headed up by women. So it's not just women, it's all their descendants and their families. I am an academic in economics, so I just finished a paper about the effects of COVID in the labor market outcomes for men and women in Colombia. We documented in that paper the phenomenon that we call female staircase fall. When women lose status in the labor market, the formal female workers transition to informal jobs, occupied women fall into unemployment, the unemployed go to inactivity, and therefore more and more women are relegated to domestic work because of the pandemic. Even more, many women can fall directly into the inactivity from any labor state due to the pressure of the housework, and that all the schools are closed, which implies that a rapid slide down in the staircase towards exclusive dedications to unpaid care and housework. So I am very worried about that, and I am wondering what is going to happen with the next generation. If we don't solve this problem, that generation will see their moms relegated to the private sphere, vulnerable and dependent, and the fathers are going to be working in the public sphere, stereotypes are going to be reinforced for that generation. And that has huge repercussions in behavior and labor market outcomes in the future of those generations.
Thank you, Ana Maria, for that very good explanation, and the idea that we have to worry not just about the immediate future, but the long term seems like a very important point. Ivan, why don't we continue looking at Colombia for a moment and look at the security issue of the pandemic? What is the power grabbing dynamic by the armed groups, particularly in rural areas? How are you seeing that COVID is affecting the implementation of the peace agreement in a more broad way?
Thank you very much. Well, this is an issue which is, a great concern in Colombia. Obviously, the peace accord was signed in 2016. It's had its ups and downs. There have been massive achievements, and yet at the same time, soon after that peace accord, we saw a whole series of smaller armed groups, residual elements of the FARC guerrillas, which signed the accord, the ELN guerrillas, which saw an opportunity to grow after the accord, and a whole host of other smaller criminal groups, fragments of paramilitary, former paramilitary organizations. They've all staked their claim to the various illicit economies in Colombia. And of course, at the center of the illicit economies is coca and cocaine and the world market for that drug. So what we've seen in COVID, unfortunately, is an exacerbation of those trends. Deep in the rural areas where this violence takes place, armed groups have had greater freedom to assert territorial and community control over their communities. We've seen a high tide of massacres, 77 massacres so far this year, over 300 victims, continuing killing of social leaders, which is a very disturbing phenomenon because these are at the front line of the implementation of various parts of the peace accord. We're seeing continuing killing of former combatants of the FARC. Yet at the same time, we're seeing the FARC operating more normally and freely in Colombian national politics than ever before. And we're seeing the vast majority of the FARC rank and file have demobilized and are on reintegration programs with all the difficulties that they imply. So it's not a totally clear picture, but there's no doubt at the rural level, there is concern that we're seeing a new wave of violence. Now, how will COVID and the pandemic and the recession induced by the lockdown affect all of this? I mean, the government says it still will be funding the peace accord and is increasing, it claims, funding for the main programs of the peace accord. We'll have to see whether that happens in 2021. But I think just taking up what Ana Maria has said about the effect on households of the pandemic, I mean, one of the worst aspects of the pandemic and the lockdown in Colombia has been effectively the closure of almost all schools. 80–90% of schools remain closed at the moment. And this, especially in those rural areas where the state presence is maybe not complete, this is an opportunity for armed groups to recruit young people. And some of these massacres, which we've seen in recent months, seem to be targeted at young people who are maybe caught between, continuing their legal lives and trying to study at school in whatever way and being drawn towards armed groups. So this is a very serious situation. And also, I mean, lastly, we are concerned that the government response to these challenges from armed groups is a security first approach. But as we see elsewhere, not just in Colombia, these local armed groups, they pride themselves on exerting discipline at the local level, and when they're attacked, their targets tend also to be at the local level, the local communities. They don't necessarily fight with state forces so much as before. They're not these large, vertically integrated guerrilla forces or narco forces, which we saw previously in Colombian history. They're pretty small scale, but they're extremely violent. And they will exact revenge if they feel they're under pressure or their illicit economies are being challenged. And this is the worry, that we are losing the sort of sight of those long-term reforms essential to bring Colombia out of its cycle of violence. And we'll just have to see how things develop over the next year, I think.
Thanks, Ivan. And maybe I'm going to stay with you because I'm seeing a question that is coming from the YouTube public person, but something that I was also thinking about, which is how is this affecting Mexico and Central America, and particularly the dynamics of narco trafficking groups and gangs. So could you tell us how you're seeing this situation taking place, or worsening the situation that we already have in Mexico and the Northern Triangle?
Absolutely, Renata. And of course, I would refer all participants who are interested to a recent report we published on this trend and in Mexico and Central America, how levels of violence have been affected. And I think what we saw in a graph, which we published in that report, is if we look at the murder levels in Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, generally they dropped slightly in Central America at the start of the pandemic. Movement restrictions, travel restrictions, people were not out so much, gangs were not out so much, but they've gone back up since. And in Mexico, really, the murder rate never changed, even though Mexico's official COVID death toll, which is a huge undercount, as the government admits, is over 100,000. Violence never changed. Violence was not altered at any stage. And there are various reasons for this. I mean, there is an intense competition for numerous forms of illicit income in Mexico. It's not just drugs and drug trafficking anymore. There is a growing trend to move towards exploiting, predating on illicit commodity chains, avocados, iron ore, gold mining, of forcing those legal producers to pay extortion money to local criminal groups who effectively control it. We know that criminal groups have become more diversified in their income. Again, they're also much more fragmented with much more local stronghold. And they use the opportunity of the pandemic, the opportunity or the challenge, if you like, to continue their battles for securing control over those illicit income streams. And the violence goes on, and the state response remains generally quite militarized and doesn't seem to address the key challenge in Mexico, which remains impunity, the failure to bring the main perpetrators of violence to justice. Very briefly, Central America is a much more varied picture. Honduras and Guatemala, we see ongoing violence between gangs, schisms of gangs, violence between obviously security forces and these gangs. So violence has gone back to those initial pre-pandemic levels. And obviously the extortion economies, which are so important, have got going again and maybe expanding in various areas, which is a great concern. And that leaves us with El Salvador, which is perhaps the most interesting case of all, because although violence has ticked back up, it remains historically really very low indeed. And that the government, the populist government of Nayib Bukele, claims it's because of their tough law enforcement, but the evidence is mounting, and we've studied this in depth, that there might be some form of informal accommodation with gangs, with the Mara Salvatrucha, with the Barrio 18, the two main sort of gang federations in El Salvador. And the question is raised, well, could those move towards negotiations? Could there actually be a real agreement to reduce violence in one of the world's most murderous countries? And we hope so. But obviously, with a populist government, with the pandemic, with political challenges and political competition, the circumstances are extremely difficult for that sort of new wave policy to be carried out in a transparent and effective way.
Thank you. So why don't we turn to one last question from me before we go back to what the audience is asking. And perhaps I can ask you both to address the policy responses that might work to the challenges that you have both described so well this morning. Ana Maria, maybe we can start with you in terms of economic development, economic crisis, and on the gender angle. What do you think the EU, the international community at large, could be doing? It's very worrisome the way that you have described the crisis as really undoing the progress that the region have worked so hard to do for the last decade, and it's going to take an incredible effort to go back to where we had left before the pandemic hit us. So what do you think? What would you suggest our colleagues from the EU and member states that are watching us? What can the international community do for Latin America in this area?
Well, I think that the best way to help is by articulating efforts. If everyone is pointing at different goals, it will be not effective. I believe also that all help should also be conditional to achieving gender-specific goals. Otherwise, gender inequality is going to be forgotten, and we will end up going back decades and relegated women to the domestic sphere. I don't know if I have stressed this enough. There are 3 interesting initiatives that we are working on in the UNDP. The first one is collecting data for designing accurate policy. The other one is recognize, reduce, and redistribute care. And the other one is create a safety net for the most vulnerable groups. So I'm going to give you just some details about each of these initiatives. The first one, we join efforts with the World Bank to collect representative data from each Latin American country to understand their specific problems and the effects of the COVID in each country. With this, we're going to design relevant policy, public policy, and share this with governments. The second one, we are working in making visible unpaid care and its implications on gender gaps. We have a project where we provide citizens with qualitative and quantitative measurements of gender difference through social media and a web page, in such a way that women organizations and policymakers can speak the same language. For example, we're working in this web page in a macro toy model that includes the care sector, unlike most of the macro models. And everyone can use it and play with it, and it serves as a tool to promote equality. Now citizens, not only PhDs in economics, can advocate to include the care sector in all public policy tools, such macroeconomics models. Otherwise, policymakers will forget about investing in the care sector and therefore on gender equality, since they took a lot of decisions with these models. The third one, and the last one, is that UNDP is also joining forces with IDB to carry out experimental interventions to solve the problem faced by migrant women. Migrant women issues are little explored because generally we think of the migrant population addressing only problems that concern men. For example, I remember when I was a High Commissioner for Gender Equality in Colombia, and the international help provide health hygiene kits for migrants. And it was a surprise when I saw that those kits didn't include menstrual hygiene products that are so basic and important. So migrant women have a number of different problems, and the new waves of migrants, Venezuelan, Nicaraguan, Haitian, include more women, and a high proportion of them are pregnant and with young kids. That is why we are studying the realities of these women and making interventions to understand how to help them and help them to overcome the obstacles to achieve a better life.
Thanks so much, Ana Maria. Ivan.
Thank you very much, Renata. Well, I'm just going to throw 3 things out there, but I think these are grounded in what the EU has been doing recently and could do more of. And number 1 is absolutely essential for our work and the worst crises we're covered, which is EU mediation capacity in internal political conflicts. We've seen a very successful intervention with the UN and the Church in Bolivia recently, to broker the arrangement for new elections, which have been highly successful. There's a new government in power there, and the terrible, bitter dispute over last year's election fraud, whatever you want to call it, has been more. The EU has put a lot of diplomatic effort into a very difficult situation through the International Contact Group, through its mission to discuss with the Venezuelan government conditions for the December elections a few months ago. Not successful, but they remain absolutely crucial to achieving really the only way out of the Venezuelan crisis, which is a negotiated settlement. And this is something which the EU is probably going to have to do more of in Latin America. This is a profoundly divided, politically fragmented region at the moment, in which regional institutions like the Organization of American States are divided, split. They don't operate, they're not recognized as legitimate actors by all countries in the region. So the EU does have that legitimacy still and can trade on that. Two other things I would briefly point to. One is that the EU should be aware and ready to back new security initiatives. So not maybe the more traditional, strengthening of capacities in the police and military, but looking a bit towards new wave demobilization programs, reintegration for former criminal members, looking at ways to address impunity in judicial systems, which there have been hugely successful efforts to do so. I'm looking particularly at the work of the CICIG in Guatemala, but they can be replicated in other contexts. Not every country is suffering rising homicide in Latin America. In fact, if you look at the last decade, 8, 9, or 10 countries have brought their homicide rates down. There are lessons out there, and the EU can be a sort of force multiplier in this respect, backing new policies. And lastly, of course, absolutely crucially, given those terrible, very, very difficult migrant flows of people, fleeing economic despair in Central America or Venezuela, the EU's got to be there with the humanitarian response mechanisms, supporting humanitarian relief. Yes, it's not a long-term solution to those problems, but for those people in desperate need, I think it's absolutely urgent, and more so now than ever.
Great, thank you both for that. So let's turn now to some of the questions that we're getting from the audience. And we have one, perhaps this is more directed, well, not because Ana Maria, you've been studying the border too, about Venezuela and the crisis in that country, and how to deal with the lack of credible information from Venezuela, and the impact that lack of data has on the diagnosis and solution to the migrant crisis, but also the humanitarian crisis. Do you guys think that the UNHCR standards are good enough to answer the Venezuelan migration? What are we going to do with the fact that, and I imagine this extends to COVID, there's very weak data in terms of the COVID impact on Venezuela. And I imagine that on the impact that it has had on gender issues, so the same. So maybe Ivan, you want to tackle this first, and then I turn to Ana Maria?
A very knotty problem indeed. I mean, reliable statistics from the Venezuelan government, whether they're economic, whether their health, have not been available for a number of years, and there are really serious reasons to doubt the reliability of the COVID statistics. Unfortunately, because there is so little testing going on in Venezuela, I believe there are only 2 centers for processing tests at the moment. So we don't know. I mean, we do know that a large number of very senior government officials have regrettably come down with COVID, but we just don't know the extent in the population. And this is not just a problem in Venezuela, it's a problem in Mexico as well, where testing is not an official government policy. I mean, tests happen, but the governments don't roll out tests as they should do. That said, we do not see the sort of terrible accumulation of death which has been seen in other Latin American contexts where COVID has gone out of control. I'm particularly referring to Guayaquil in Ecuador back in March and April. That hasn't been detected, and Colombian authorities close to the border haven't detected it either. So there are reasons to think that maybe the worst is over, although it's extremely hard to say. As for other sorts of information, I mean, there are experts working independently in Venezuela, trying to understand hyperinflation, trying to understand the state of the economy, doing as best as they can in a very difficult situation. We know roughly how much oil is being produced, how much oil is being exported. I mean, the statistics are bleak. I mean, the conditions in Venezuela are awful. We know that according to the best living standards survey, the NCOVI survey in Venezuela, which came out just a few months ago, 90% of Venezuelans are living in poverty. We have the figures from the UN, we have the humanitarian assessments from the UN. We have the data which we need to know that the situation is extremely difficult indeed, even if the government is not distributing this information itself.
Thank you. Ana Maria, do you want to?
I think Ivan addressed most of the question, but yes, we don't have good statistics, but for this moment, but a lot of countries don't have good statistics right now. If you want to know what is happening, I think UN has been a huge effort to try to collect some data and make some assessments of what is happening. So I think that that's the primary source to understand what is happening in Venezuela right now.
Thank you both. So let's turn to a question that I think is very connected to the point that Ana Maria made early on about how the COVID crisis has sort of exposed the inequality and made it much more visible. And that in a way is going to be something that the countries are going to have to address in a more clear way, at least acknowledging that that's happening. But are there any concrete, reliable national or regional plans that you can see to address these structural factors, both the structural factors that have led to the inequality and the poverty, but also the structural factors that have led to violence? Are we seeing that the governments are taking advantage of perhaps this window of opportunity that the COVID is producing in the region to actually come up with answers that might do a real long-term change, or are we still seeing only kind of immediate reactions? Ana Maria, can I turn to you first?
Well, unfortunately, no. When you start looking at all policies in the trackers of UN, most of them are for helping and try to survive in this moment. And if you see, everyone is making unconditional transfers, and that helps to survive, but it's not going to change the way we are going. But I think we are just experiencing the pandemic. So the next step will be to rethink and to make policies and changes in the structure of our countries. So I hope that is the next step, that you can see that in Europe and New Zealand, they are in that step, looking to the long run instead of the short run.
Thank you. Ivan.
This is a great question. I mean, the efforts to bring about real big structural change there've been a few. I mean, I look at the Colombian Peace Accord in particular as an example of that, but they have their great problems. There was also the Alliance for Prosperity connected to all those different anti-corruption missions in the last few years of Obama administration. But again, I mean, it stopped. It was challenged and it went into reverse. You know, the one thing I would really like to see across Latin American governments, and here I'll point to Ana Maria because I know this is, you know, a big issue for the UNDP. When you look at Latin American countries' inequality and then look at the effects of government transfers and spending on inequality, in Europe, you see that once governments start spending and handing out welfare payments and you know, funding education and health, inequality, it goes right down. Government spending brings inequality right down. And that's one of the points of state action in Europe. Alas, in Latin America, the overall effect of government spending is virtually zero on inequality. Inequality remains the same. Government programs are not trained towards inequality. And one of the reasons behind that is obviously the size of the informal economy, because these informal economies perpetuate inequality over the long run. But for many governments, I think the reality is that they prefer people being in the informal economy, even if they don't actually pay any tax, to being recipients of welfare payments, which the government doesn't make. It's an alternative to welfare. fundamentally, and it perpetuates itself in that way, and it entrenches inequality over the longer run. And how to sort of break that, knot to move forward is something which, I think we are still failing to do, and I hope the UNDP is going to give us some good advice on that in the years to come.
Thank you, Ivan. It made me think actually about the commentary that we just published on Brazil, though, and the sort of very immediate effect on the popularity of Bolsonaro that this cash aid is bringing. Bolsa Familia did end up bringing enormous amounts of people out of poverty, right? So it can happen if there is the will, but unfortunately, it seems that we're not. We have now two questions that are kind of related and coming from somebody watching us on YouTube. Perhaps Ivan, this will be directed more for you, but Ana Maria, obviously, let me know if you have something to say on this question, which is if the pandemic is going to actually end up legitimizing state of emergency frameworks for decision making in Latin America. So governments in Latin America have always been very attracted to status of exception, whatever the local term is, mechanisms that actually withdraw important decision-making areas from the public scrutiny and the political debate. And the pandemic is certainly one that is contributing to that tendency. Do you see that? Is this going to be something that has a long-term effect and kind of makes even more tempting for executives in the region to take these measures?
Great question. The tendency towards concentration of power in Latin America are there. There are various factors. There's obviously populism, populist leaders, anti-system leaders who believe that, they are the enemy of the state within the state. Bolsonaro, Lopez Obrador, I could name others, whether good or bad. They do have, not so much Bolsonaro maybe. Lopez Obrador does have some, he has an appeal, and he has embraced some interesting policies. But that is clearly an authoritarian threat across the region. States of emergency in response to health crises are also, a threat. We're seeing parliaments being bypassed. We're seeing presidents taking more executive decisions. We're seeing a growing role, obviously, during the lockdown in particular, you look at Colombia, of the police and the military in imposing lockdown-related restrictions. All of this creates an environment in which, power can be concentrated and executive power can be wielded. But, and it's a major but, the reality of Latin American politics is there's a real risk for presidents to assume sole control at a moment where it's very difficult to provide the people with the solutions which they would like in economic or health terms. And it's probably in the interest of a number of rulers to shift or delegate responsibility in other areas. And also bear in mind that parliaments in a number of countries are extremely powerful. Peru turfed out its president a few weeks ago, Peru's parliament, and obviously causing a huge crisis in the process. But it's not as if we are living in here in Latin America in countries which embrace authoritarianism automatically in the face of any social difficulty. These are fragmented countries, competitive countries with multiple political forces. Democracy is maybe not perfect, flawed, but it is something which appeals to Latin American people, and Latin Americans take it very dearly indeed. It is an achievement to have come out of the dictatorships of 30, 40 years ago and to have secured democracy, and they will not give it up lightly. That said, if leaders offer effective solutions which seem to overcome the problems of the people and appeal to them, they will become popular. This is a fact. So I think there's a tension. I don't think it's clear by any stretch of the imagination. And I would think it's very risky for a president ahead of 2021 to assume extreme executive powers in the face of what could be a very difficult year for the region.
Thank you. Anna, do you want to add something to that, or should we move to the next one?
I agree with Ivan that Latin America is a democratic region. The only fear of this moment is that people could vote out of the like the fear and being disappointed. But so either that can happen, or that people really want huge changes and try to put people in the power that can address those changes as equality and green growth and so on. So I hope people can use this moment of discomfort to have the power to put the right people on power instead of just try to move and vote against of someone.
Thank you, Anna. We have a question now about the international relationships between Latin America, the EU, and the US. And there's two sub questions to that one. First is, should we be worried that the second wave hitting Europe is going to affect the way in which Europe has been able to support Latin America and make funds available for the region's humanitarian development and security urgencies? What will be the impact of a more difficult economic situation in Europe, you know, in this kind of aid? And what does the Biden victory mean for a coordinated responses of these urgencies? And if I may add to just that particular look, how do you imagine a more positive interaction between the US and Latin America can be shaped in now with the change of administration in Washington? Ivan, you want to tackle that first?
This is a very interesting issue. I mean, it's very early days, indeed. We know. I mean, Europe is in a crisis situation, but we do believe that, you know, their humanitarian agencies are responsive to what is going on elsewhere, and I think they will be able to step up to assist in Latin America in the coming months. As I said, particularly with those, you know, situations in Venezuela and Central America in mind. I think with the US. The main change we will see will be towards a more multilateral approach to Latin America. I think there's no doubt in saying that President Trump's administration has focused on core American, US interests and applied them to Latin America. So it's been migration, obviously, from Central America and Mexico. It's been the terms of trade, particularly with Mexico. It's been the threat of socialism. And the troika of tyranny related to Venezuela and Cuba, and much of the rest of the relations with Latin America have been, you know, put in the freezer or left to one side and not really addressed with any commitment. I think we would see a Biden administration wishing to engage with all Latin American countries, trying probably to abstain from deciding which are the good and the bad governments, but engaging as far as possible, and it will not be easy, with all governments in the region. And one would hope trying to reach a concerted, consensual position with regard to the main crisis at the moment, which is Venezuela. So bring on board not just the countries obviously opposed to Maduro, we know them, Colombia, Brazil, Chile, Peru, and others, but trying to bring on those countries which are left-wing, sympathetic to Maduro, but democratically elected. And I mean, this is a work which will be in progress. It won't be easy. As I said, the regional politics in Latin America is extremely difficult at the moment. The regional institutions are divided, but we do hope that the US will put its effort in. And if the US leads an effort to restore a sound multilateral approach in Latin America, I think Latin American countries at the moment, given the crisis they're in, given the difficulties they face, will provide their support to that effort.
Thanks, Ivan. And Maria, you might want to also maybe address, is there anything that you see that the US could do that will be particularly useful in coordination with the EU for the region? Or just what do you think the EU could do that could help, particularly the gender angle of this problematic that will be useful?
Well, when I was working at the government in Colombia, US was one of the the one that help most with the topic of migration. So I think their help is key to solve these kind of new dynamics that we see in Latin America. I think that Latin America is going to be more important in all the decisions in US, and I think that is going to happen because Latino vote was very relevant for the decision in some of the states. So I think that the government has to appeal to that Latin vote. And that is going to make Latin America to be again important in the decisions in US.
Thank you. The next question that we have, we are just noting that we have a little bit over 5 minutes, so we're going to be wrapping up soon. But there is a question about the growth of xenophobia in Latin America vis-a-vis Venezuelan migrants, particularly in Colombia. How do you see that this is connected to the social economic impacts of COVID? Do you think that xenophobia has been getting worse because of the crisis? And how to tackle this issue, in the coming months, if, as Ivan was saying earlier, the border is open and hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans returning to Colombia. You could imagine xenophobia going up there, but that has also been happening in Peru and Chile and other countries in the region. How can we ameliorate the impact of this xenophobic reaction? Ivan, do you want to tackle that?
I mean, this is a very pressing question. We know from the polls in Colombia that 60–70% of Colombians now reject the presence of Venezuelans. There are unfortunately a number of comments regarding the supposed involvement of Venezuelans in violent crime, which have been made by senior political figures from across the spectrum. I mean, this is not a great moment. I mean, bearing in mind, of course, the Colombian economy has taken a big hit under COVID as well. I mean, unemployment has soared. The GDP fell considerably, around about between 5–7% expected for this year. So this is not, the environment is not particularly hospitable. Obviously, a vital first step will be to make as many Venezuelans as possible legal in the country, so they can be removed from that sort of stigma of being a sort of marginal, poor, desperate presence, which you sometimes see. You see it quite a lot, alas, in the bigger cities of Colombia, and can be incorporated into normal economy with a certain coverage from social services. Now, but this might not go down too well in Colombia at the moment, but I think it's essential that Colombia is aware that these are young people who have fled their country. They can contribute to the growth of Colombia over the medium to long run if they are given the right conditions. But I think it's also very important to bear in mind that the idea that Venezuelans are, this new wave of criminality in the country should be tempered by the fact that they are often being absorbed by Colombian organized criminal activities, which look to them as cheap labor for their illicit revenues. And this is what's been happening, for example, in the coca growing regions of Norte de Santander on the border with Venezuela, where yes, Venezuelans are being employed at cut price rates to pick coca, but it's not as if that is their response, not as if they're bringing crime and violence to Colombia. They are simply, very cheap, very easy to exploit manual labor, which can be fitted into these different activities. So I think we need to take a much broader response. We need to be, sympathetic, and I think the Colombian people should be sympathetic, obviously, to the situation of the Venezuelans. We understand that it's not easy at all at the moment, but if the government here were to make it clear that this is going to be a long-term challenge with no easy solution, and that it's essential now to incorporate as many into the formal job market as possible. Hopefully, there will be some greater understanding of the situation.
Well,
Thank you, Sandra. Yeah, please.
I was reading recently an Oxfam survey for Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru about migration from Venezuela, and a majority of people think or relate men with crime and women with prostitution, migrants. So you have to address these two problems, but in a different manner, because there are two different problems. So one is that people fear that male immigration is going to bring crime, homicide, robbery, and so on. And they are hypersexualizing women, in the other hand. No? I think that with the COVID, that this is going to be even worse. And I want also to mention that even that we have all these xenophobic imaginaries about migrants. I'm working on a paper in Colombia, and to see the effect of the migration on homicide. And we see an increase in homicide, but most of the victims are Venezuelans. So it's important to study the problem, because sometimes it's not what it seems. Colombia now has to make an effort in helping Venezuelans because they have been the victims.
Thank you. That's super important and not said aloud as much, right? The victimization of the migrants. We're running out of time, but there's been a question hanging in the Q&A for a while that I want to address before we go. And I apologize for those of you who had questions that we didn't have the time to address. But it's, what are the chances that Latin America is going to get a vaccine in a timely manner? Because apparently this is the only way we're going to end up cutting the crisis short. So with the promises of a vaccine early on in the market in the few coming months, what do you think are the chances of the region having access to this? Ivan, you want to do a final word on that?
Thank you very much. Well, we know that Mexico and Argentina have struck deals with AstraZeneca for the distribution of that vaccine. I know that there's some debate at the moment as to whether it's as effective as they said it was and whether the results are as good as they said it was. But it's the cheap one. It's the cheap, easy to distribute vaccine, which can be just stored in a refrigerator. The other vaccines, the Moderna and the Pfizer ones, obviously require these minus 70 degrees conditions. I mean, it will be a challenge for Latin American countries. I mean, let's be honest, that's going to be difficult. I mean, really, Latin America needs an easy to transport, easy to distribute vaccine to come through. And that would make a massive difference. Otherwise, this is going to be a very prolonged health and economic crisis indeed. The other side, of course, of the vaccine is, will vaccines in Latin America be distributed according to need, or will they be distributed according to, how can we put it, privilege, access, wealth? That is an issue which I fear is going to become politicized, and we will see different effects of different governments. There will be countries where health systems, public health systems, are traditionally better, more effective, in Argentina, for example. And there will be others, and I'm particularly worried about Central America in this regard, to agree, obviously, Mexico as well, where there will be concerns that there will be short circuits taken by those who can get quick access to it, who want quick access to a vaccine. We'll have to see what happens. But the bottom line is this: if you don't vaccinate the entire population, including the poorest, most remote, most inaccessible parts of society, you will not have safeguarded your nation against COVID. So I think that lesson, hopefully, will remind governments that they will have to scale up and reach the poorest parts of society.
Thank you. Anna, do you want to have a last word on any of the issues that we've discussed? If not, I'm just going to thank Ana Maria and Ivan for joining us today. And before we close the session, I am going to turn to Elisa Jobson, who's the Director for Global Advocacy at Crisis Group, and is going to give us some concluding remarks. Elisa, you're there? There she is. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, Renata, for steering such a rich conversation on the economic and political consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic in Latin America. I mean, the figures that our panelists mentioned at the start of the session, 34 million jobs lost, 10% increase in poverty rates, are really sobering, as is the potential impact of the economic fallout on the region's peace and security. And I really do hope, Anna Maria, that your belief that the pandemic offers an opportunity to reduce some of these inequalities, the inequalities that plague the region, that this is borne out. Anyway, so this session that we've just had concludes this year's watch list policy dialogue. I hope you'll agree that the debates and exchanges that we've had have been interesting and enlightening. Given the limited time that we had over the last 2 days, we've managed to touch on only a few of the peace and security challenges facing the European Union. But I think the crises we have covered are really vital to European interests. And Crisis Group will continue to address these and other conflicts in upcoming EU watch list publications. Indeed, we're already in the process of producing our list for 2021, which should hopefully be out at the end of January. So this has been a new, more open format for the annual dialogue that Crisis Group holds with the EU. And we've been pleased to see not only lots of participants in the Zoom calls, but also that we've had even greater number of people who've been following the 5 conference sessions that we've had live on YouTube. I don't want to speak for long. I mean, it's getting late for some of us, but I did want to mention a few general observations that have emerged from our discussions yesterday and today, as well as from Crisis Group's broader engagement with the EU and also our analysis from the field. First, I mean, I think it's impossible not to touch on the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's not a coincidence that the discussions of the pandemic have bookended our debates over the past 2 days. The impact of the virus will be felt for many years to come, and the EU's response at home and abroad to the crisis will inevitably shape its ability to continue its role in conflict prevention and crisis response and peace building. As Hilda Hardeman, the Director and Head of Service for Policy Instruments at the European Commission, noted in her opening remarks yesterday, the Commission has sought opportunities to advance its conflict resolution agenda while providing humanitarian relief for the countries that have been hardest hit by the pandemic. And this is really laudable. But one thing I want to say is that the EU and its member states must really resist the desire to retrench and focus more firmly on handling the domestic fallout of coronavirus. Instead, by maintaining and possibly even increasing support to the most fragile states, this is arguably even more necessary now than it was before the pandemic. The second point I'd like to make sort of flows out of this and touches on the role that the EU can play globally. As my colleague Richard Atwood mentioned yesterday at the start of the programme, the prospect of a new US administration is a positive development, especially for multilateralism. While the UN has had its hands tied somewhat in recent years by the playing out of great power rivalries, particularly, but not exclusively within the UN Security Council, but the EU has managed to keep the multilateral flag flying. The fact that we've had a number of UN officials as well as EU officials on the panels over the last couple of days illustrates how important the relationship between these two institutions is to helping resolve and prevent conflict around the world. It's also clear from some of the discussions that we've had that cooperation and not competition should be the watchword for these and other multilateral bodies as they engage globally. Finally, I wanted to reflect on the annual watch list policy dialogue itself. and the fact that the EU is prepared to take part in this kind of open discussion. Many institutions that we engage with would not be willing to do this. In our interactions with the EU, Crisis Group often challenges the EU's approach to individual crises. I mean, our discussion yesterday on the Sahel did just that. And also, we don't shy away from showing the limits of certain types of engagement. And, hopefully in doing this, we can help lay the ground for constructive thinking about new ways in which the EU can address the challenges it faces in its external interventions. Before closing this edition of the Policy Dialogue, I'd like to offer a few words of appreciation to those who have made our discussion possible. First of all, I want to thank Lavinia Pletsu, our EU project officer, who deserves much of the credit for organising this conference, bringing us all together and supporting our crisis group's engagement together with the rest of our EU team in Brussels. So thanks a lot, Lavinia. And again, I would like to thank Hilde Hardeman, the Director and Head of Service for Policy Instruments at the European Commission, and also Stefano Tomat, Director for Integrated Approach for Security and Peace at the EEAS, for their support in our collaboration with the EU, particularly in our relationships with the EEAS and also the foreign policy instruments of the European Commission. Finally, thanks to all the participants, panelists and moderators over the last 2 days. And thanks also to all of you who joined us for these conversations, and those of you who've been following us on social media. We look forward to welcoming you back next year. Thanks a lot.